She brutalized her blind mother and Law the revenge shattered her life. She thought no one could see what she did, because the woman she hurt was blind. He walked in, just in time to hear his mother scream from the kitchen. Not just any woman, his own mother. Blind, elderly, completely dependent on her. She was the woman he trusted to care for her. The wife who smiled in public. The daughter-in-law everyone praised. She didn't know he was home early. She didn't know he was standing there, listening, watching cruelty unfold behind closed doors. He believed he had married a gentle, God-fearing woman. But what he witnessed shattered every promise he thought she kept. Now, he isn't just a husband. He's a son facing a truth he can't unsee. Expose the woman he married, or stay silent and betray the mother who gave him life. Either way, someone's world is about to collapse forever. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Ocean of Tales. Kindly like, comment, and subscribe on this channel. We will be grateful if you help us do this. We will be notifying you when we drop a new video. Don't forget to tell us where you are watching from. A sharp scream ripped through the quiet house like a plate shattering on tile, the kind of sound that makes your stomach drop before your mind can catch up. Daniel froze on the front step, keys still in his hand, breath turning cold as the hallway lights hummed too softly for what he'd just heard, and then the silence came back wrong. A gust of warm, cooked air rolled from the kitchen. Oil, onions, something burned, mixed with a metallic scent that didn't belong in a safe home. Daniel's shoes moved without permission, soft on the rug, each step swallowed by the corridor as if the house itself was trying to hide what was happening. But why was his heart pounding like danger lived here? A chair scraped violently across the floor, and a second sound followed. Skin meeting something hard, then a weak gasp that didn't fully become a cry. Daniel's throat tightened as he reached the doorway, the corner of the wall blocking the scene like a cruel curtain, and he realized the scream had come from a voice he hadn't heard beg in years. A trembling hand fumbled along the counter edge, old fingers searching for stability, knuckles pale, nails worn down from too much gripping. Margaret stood half-turned, eyes blank and unfocused, face lifted like she was trying to see with her ears, her body bracing for the next hit, and Daniel's mind refused to accept that this was his mother. A soft laugh cut through the steam, small, controlled, practiced, followed by the quick snap of movement that made Margaret flinch before anything even touched her. Rebecca's silhouette was calm in the kitchen light, posture steady like this was normal, like cruelty was just another chore. And Daniel's blood ran hot with a question he wasn't ready to answer. A pot lid rattled against the stovetop, and Daniel saw a wet sheen on the floor that wasn't just spilled water, reflecting the overhead bulb in shaky, nervous highlights. Margaret's lips moved in a silent prayer, shoulders caved inward, dignity folding in on itself, and Daniel felt something inside him break clean in two. A single step forward made the floorboard betray him with a quiet creak, and Rebecca's head snapped slightly, as if she'd sensed a witness the way predators sense light. Daniel stood at the edge of the doorway, swallowed by the smell of heat and harm, knowing 1 second would decide everything, but would he protect his mother, or the life he thought he had? Morning light slipped uselessly across the curtains as Margaret sat upright on the edge of her bed, hands folded neatly in her lap, listening to the house wake up before she did. She couldn't see the day begin, but she could hear it. Footsteps measured, doors closing too softly, and she already knew what kind of day it would be. A cup touched her palm with careful precision, porcelain warm, liquid sloshing just enough to warn her not to move too fast. Margaret murmured thanks out of habit, but her shoulders stayed tense, because kindness in this house had become unpredictable, arriving without warning and leaving just as quickly. A shift in the air made her flinch, not sound, not touch, just presence. Margaret had learned that cruelty announced itself differently than love. Love lingered. Cruelty hovered. And every time Rebecca stood too close, Margaret's breath shortened, as if her body remembered what her eyes no longer could. A spoon scraped the bowl a little too hard, metal against ceramic, sharp enough to make Margaret's fingers tighten. Meals used to mean comfort. Now they were tests, Too hot, too cold, too late. Each mistake quietly punished. Margaret swallowed carefully, wondering which version of the day she was being allowed to survive. A sudden silence pressed down on the room, thick and watchful, the kind that waits for weakness. Margaret reached for the table edge, steadying herself, heart-tapping warnings against her ribs. She prayed silently, not for rescue, but for strength, because strength was the only thing no one could take. A gentle memory brushed her thoughts. Daniel as a boy, laughing, running, clinging to her skirt with careless trust. That memory kept her upright now, kept her enduring the sharp tones and colder pauses, because a mother's love doesn't go blind, even when the world does. A step sounded behind her without warning, too close, too sudden, and Margaret's spine stiffened before her mind could catch up. She held her breath, bracing for what always came next, never knowing if this moment would pass quietly or become another wound she'd have to hide. Sunday sunlight spilled across polished floors as Rebecca stood at the front of the church, posture perfect, smile soft, hands folded like a woman who had mastered goodness. Heads turned toward her with approval, whispers of admiration floating behind pressed lips, because everyone saw what she wanted them to see, but none of them lived inside her house. Laughter followed her into public spaces, measured, gentle, rehearsed, each note landing exactly where it should. Rebecca knew when to nod, when to lower her eyes, when to speak about sacrifice and patience. People leaned in when she talked about caring for Daniel's blind mother, unaware their praise was feeding something dark and hungry. The front door closing at home sounded different when no one else was watching. The warmth drained from Rebecca's face the moment the lock clicked shut, heels tapping sharply across tile like punctuation marks. Inside these walls, smiles expired quickly, and silence became a tool sharper than shouting. Small controls crept into daily life unnoticed, disguised as responsibility. Objects were moved just far enough to confuse. Routines changed without warning. Help arrived late, or not at all. Then came the quiet blame. Rebecca never raised her voice. She didn't need to. Power spoke in timing, in withholding, in making someone doubt their own footing. Daniel believed in the version of his wife he showed the world, repeating her praises to friends, defending her without being asked. He trusted the calm, the faith, the gentle touch on his arm in public. Love made him generous with excuses, but excuses don't erase what happens in the dark. Margaret felt the shift long before it was visible, sensing when affection curdled into resentment. Rebecca's kindness came in fragments now, followed by stretches of cold efficiency that made the house feel smaller, tighter, like air was being rationed. The marriage looked solid from the outside, admired, envied, held up as an example of grace under pressure. But beneath the smiles and prayers, something poisonous was growing quietly, and the longer it stayed hidden, the more damage it was preparing to do. The weight of the house pressed down on Daniel's chest as he stood alone in the hallway that night, the walls too quiet, the air too still. Every step he took felt measured against something heavier than his own body, as if the floor itself was asking which side he belonged to and whether he was strong enough to choose. A wedding ring glinted faintly under the light as Daniel rubbed his thumb across it, remembering vows spoken with confidence and hope. He had promised loyalty, protection, partnership. Those words had once felt clean and simple. Now they sat in his mouth like stones, because vows meant one thing when spoken in love, and something else entirely when weighed against blood. A soft cough echoed from Margaret's room, fragile and uncertain, the sound of someone trying not to ask for help. Daniel's feet shifted toward her door before he caught himself, heart racing with a fear he didn't want to name. He knew that silence had already chosen a side once, and it was threatening to do it again. A memory flashed uninvited through his mind, his mother working late nights, skipping meals, sacrificing comfort, so he could have options she never did. That woman was smaller now, bent by age and darkness, but the debt he owed her had not disappeared. If anything, it had grown heavier. Rebecca's voice drifted faintly from another room, calm, controlled, almost soothing, as if nothing in this house was wrong. That contrast tore at Daniel more than anger ever could. He wondered how love had blinded him so completely, and how long it would take to forgive himself. Every excuse he'd ever made replayed in his head, each one sounding thinner than the last. He told himself peace mattered. That confrontation would break everything. But peace built on suffering wasn't peace. It was cowardice wearing a respectable face. Daniel stood between two doors, one leading to the life he had built, the other to the woman who had built him. His chest tightened as he realized delay was no longer neutral, and whatever he chose next would change all three of their lives forever. Cold water slid over Margaret's wrists at the sink, numbing her fingers as she counted breaths to steady the shaking in her hands. She moved slowly, carefully, because rushing brought accidents, and accidents brought punishment disguised as concern. The tap hissed like a warning, and she wondered how a simple task could feel like a test she was never meant to pass. Footsteps paused just out of reach, close enough to feel, far enough to deny help. Margaret waited, listening to the rhythm of another presence deciding whether kindness would be offered today or withheld. The pause stretched thin, then broke, leaving her alone with the sound of her own heart asking a question she didn't dare speak. A plate met the table with a dull thud, food placed without care, heat uneven, edges sharp with impatience. Margaret thanked the air out of habit and lifted the fork with caution, praying the first bite wouldn't burn her tongue or spill onto her clothes. Hunger taught her restraint, but fear taught her silence, and silence kept her alive. Time crawled in the house like thick dust, settling on everything Margaret loved. She learned the geography by memory, the angles of furniture by bruises, the moods by temperature. When the rooms went quiet, she knew to be smaller. When they went busy, she knew to disappear. Survival became a map drawn in her mind. Night pressed against her bedroom walls, bringing aches she never mentioned and tears she wiped away before they could fall. Margaret knelt by the bed, palms open, asking for strength instead of rescue. She believed endurance was holy, that patience could protect her son from a truth too heavy to carry, but was she wrong? A memory warmed her chest briefly, Daniel's childhood laughter echoing like sunlight through trees. That sound reminded her why she swallowed pain, why she smiled when she should have spoken. A mother's love doesn't measure the cost. It pays it quietly, again and again. A sharp noise cracked the calm without warning. Something dropped, something slammed, something close. Margaret stiffened, breath caught mid-prayer, knowing the silence had shifted again, and unsure whether this moment would pass unnoticed or become another scar she'd have to hide. Soft hymns drifted from Rebecca's phone each morning, filling the kitchen with gentle melodies that suggested peace and devotion. She moved through prayer like a performance, head bowed, hands steady, voice calm enough to convince anyone watching that goodness lived comfortably in her chest. But faith, when worn like costume jewelry, shines brightest in public and cuts deepest in private. Church friends praised her endlessly, their admiration following her home in the form of polite calls and thoughtful messages. Rebecca accepted every compliment with humility, speaking about sacrifice, about caring for Daniel's blind mother with patience and grace. Each word tightened the knot of deception, because no one ever suspects cruelty when it kneels so well. The house transformed the moment the door closed, hymns silenced, postures sharpened, movements clipped. Rebecca's kindness evaporated without sound, replaced by efficiency that left no room for warmth. Instructions were given instead of help, corrections instead of care. She never raised her voice. Control didn't require volume. Scripture slipped easily into her cruelty, verses twisted into warnings, obedience framed as virtue. Margaret was reminded of patience, of submission, of endurance as proof of faith. Every misuse of holy words felt heavier than anger, because it demanded suffering not just from the body, but from the soul. Daniel believed in his wife's righteousness, repeating her words without hearing their edges. He admired her discipline, her spiritual strength, her ability to handle pressure. Love blinded him to how power had disguised itself as responsibility. And the more he trusted, the deeper the damage settled. Margaret felt the betrayal most during prayers, when silence made room for truth. She wondered how goodness could hurt this much, how faith could feel like a weapon in someone else's hand. Still, she whispered amen, hoping God could see what people refused to notice. A quiet satisfaction flickered in Rebecca's eyes one evening, brief but unmistakable, as Margaret hesitated mid-step, unsure, unsteady. In that look lived certainty, the kind that believes it will never be questioned. Unaware that truth, once stirred, never stays buried for long. The front door opened without ceremony that evening, hinges whispering instead of announcing Daniel's return, as if the house itself was holding its breath. He had planned to be home early. Traffic shifted. Meetings ended sooner. Small changes, meaningless on their own until they placed him exactly where he was never meant to be. A sharp sound traveled down the hallway, not loud enough to be a scream, but too broken to be normal. Daniel stopped mid-step, keys tightening in his palm as his ears strained for clarity. The house felt different now, charged, like the air before a storm, and something deep in his chest warned him not to ignore it. Heat rolled from the kitchen doorway, thick with oil and tension, carrying with it the scrape of metal and a breathless gasp that cut through Daniel's composure. He moved closer without thinking, heart pounding hard enough to drown out reason, every instinct screaming that whatever waited inside would change him. Margaret's voice broke through the noise, thin, shaken, trying to form words that never fully arrived. Daniel froze at the edge of the wall, just out of sight, watching his mother's body fold inward as if bracing against something invisible. Her hands trembled in the air, searching for safety that wasn't offered. Rebecca's movements were calm and precise, controlled in a way that felt rehearsed. There was no panic, no surprise, only irritation, like an interruption to a routine she expected to finish. Daniel's stomach twisted as he realized this wasn't a mistake, it was habit. Time stretched painfully in that moment, seconds pulling apart as Daniel stood hidden, witnessing truth without the comfort of distance. Every excuse he'd ever made collapsed at once, replaced by the heavy certainty that silence had helped build this cruelty. A floorboard shifted under his weight, a small, accidental sound that sliced through the tension like a blade. Rebecca's head tilted slightly, sensing change, while Daniel stood exposed to the truth he could never unknow and the choice he could no longer avoid. The air between the kitchen walls thickened instantly, as if the house itself sensed the shift in power. Daniel stepped forward fully now, no longer hidden by corners or shadows, his presence changing the temperature of the room. Rebecca stiffened, not in fear, but in calculation, while Margaret stood frozen, unsure whether this new silence meant safety or something worse. Daniel's breath came slow and deliberate, each inhale carrying the weight of everything he had just seen. His eyes moved from the trembling outline of his mother to the composed posture of his wife, and the distance between them felt wider than the room could hold. Love and disbelief collided in his chest, leaving him struggling to recognize which emotion deserved to win. Rebecca's face softened quickly, the practiced version returning like muscle memory. Shoulders relaxed. Expression gentled. The image she perfected for the world slid effortlessly back into place, as if truth could be overwritten by familiarity. Daniel felt the pull of it, the temptation to accept the lie and retreat into comfort, but something inside him refused to go quiet again. Margaret shifted slightly toward his voice, hope and fear braided tightly in her posture.
She didn't speak.
She didn't accuse. Her silence asked the hardest question of all. Would he finally see her, or look away one last time? Daniel felt that question settle into his bones. Thoughts raced through his mind in ruthless succession, consequences stacking up faster than he could process them. Exposure would destroy his marriage, shatter reputations, invite judgment. Silence would preserve appearances, but at the cost of his mother's dignity and his own soul. Either path demanded sacrifice, and neither offered peace. Rebecca's eyes searched his face carefully, waiting for the smallest sign of surrender. She had relied on his hesitation before. She trusted his love to protect her now. That trust felt like a final insult, daring him to prove her right. Daniel opened his mouth to speak, knowing the next words would burn bridges that could never be rebuilt. The room seemed to lean toward him, listening, as he stood on the edge of a decision that would end one life as he knew it, and begin another he could no longer escape. The days that followed shifted subtly, then all at once, like a crack spreading through glass before it finally gives way. Rebecca still moved through the house with confidence, but something in her timing slipped. Doors closed a second too late. Smiles held a fraction too long. The control she once wore so easily began to feel forced, as if the ground beneath her feet had started to tilt. Daniel's presence changed without confrontation, his silence heavier than any accusation. He stopped defending, stopped correcting, stopped filling the space with reassurance. He watched more, listened longer. Each quiet moment felt deliberate, and Rebecca sensed it. Power doesn't vanish loudly. It drains away, leaving uncertainty in its place. Margaret noticed the difference immediately, not through sight, but through sound and air. The house felt less hostile, less sharp around the edges. Meals arrived on time. Hands hovered closer, cautious now. Cruelty had retreated, not out of remorse, but fear, and Margaret understood fear well enough to recognize it. Small fractures began appearing outside the home, where Rebecca had always felt untouchable. A church commitment slipped through her fingers. A trusted friend asked an unexpected question. A look of doubt replaced admiration in someone's eyes. Nothing dramatic, just enough to make her feel watched for the first time. Rebecca tried to tighten her grip, doubling down on appearances, volunteering more, praying louder, smiling wider. But effort replaced ease, and effort always reveals strain. The more she tried to control the narrative, the more it resisted her. Daniel quietly made moves she couldn't see, conversations held without her, arrangements shifting in the background. He wasn't rushing. He was preparing. Karma, after all, doesn't sprint. It circles patiently, waiting for the right opening. Rebecca stood alone in the kitchen one evening, surrounded by the same walls where she once felt powerful, and for the first time, the silence didn't obey her. It pressed back, heavy and judgmental, as she realized something irreversible had begun, and she no longer controlled how it would end. The shift came quietly, almost respectfully, like a door closing instead of slamming. Daniel began rearranging the house in small, deliberate ways. Furniture moved to create wider paths, locks changed for safety rather than control, routines adjusted so Margaret no longer felt like a guest in her own home. Nothing was announced. Nothing was explained. But power was being relocated. Margaret felt dignity return before she fully understood why, carried in simple gestures that didn't ask permission. A steady arm offered without impatience. A chair pulled back without commentary. Meals prepared with care instead of caution. For the first time in months, her body relaxed into the space, unsure if peace was allowed, but grateful it had arrived. Rebecca sensed the loss immediately, though no one confronted her. Control slipping away is more painful when it's invisible. She found herself excluded from decisions she once dominated, conversations happening without her knowledge, plans already settled before she could insert herself. Revenge, she realized too late, didn't need noise. It needed clarity. Truth traveled quietly but efficiently, carried by the right ears at the right time. Daniel didn't shout. He didn't accuse. He let facts stand on their own, unembellished and undeniable. The story Rebecca had carefully curated for years began to unravel, thread by thread, without drama, only consequence. Margaret was offered a choice at last, not framed as charity, but as respect. Safety. Independence. A life not built around endurance. She accepted with grace, knowing survival had taught her patience, but justice had taught her worth. Rebecca watched her influence evaporate, powerless to stop the narrative she could no longer control. No insults returned to her. No hands were raised. No punishment matched what she had given. Instead, she was left to face absence of trust, of admiration, of authority. The house stood calmer than it ever had, sunlight reaching corners once shadowed by fear. And as Margaret stepped forward into a life reclaimed without violence, Rebecca realized the cruelest revenge of all had arrived quietly, leaving her nothing to fight, and no one left to blame but herself. The first crack appeared in Rebecca's composure late one evening, when the house felt too empty to perform for. No audience. No mirrors that mattered. The silence she once controlled now pressed in from every corner, heavy and unmoving, forcing her to sit with the version of herself she had spent years denying. Tears came without ceremony, not dramatic, not cleansing, but sharp and frustrating, the kind that sting because they arrive too late. Regret settled into her chest slowly, like a weight she couldn't shift, and for the first time she understood that apologies don't undo damage, they only reveal how permanent it is. Daniel watched her unravel from a careful distance, his face unreadable, his posture steady. Whatever love he still carried had changed shape, hardened by truth. He no longer rushed to comfort or explain. Compassion remained, but it was no longer blind. Margaret felt the shift through absence, through the lack of tension that once defined her days. She did not celebrate Rebecca's pain. She did not gloat. Survival had taught her that suffering multiplies when answered with cruelty. Still, she knew something had ended, and endings, even just ones, leave scars. Rebecca searched for forgiveness like a lifeline, grasping at moments, memories, excuses that no longer held weight. Every attempt collapsed under the same truth. Remorse cannot rewrite history. It can only ask to live beside it. The cost of cruelty revealed itself slowly, not in punishment, but in isolation. Friends drifted. Trust vanished. Respect withdrew, without argument. Rebecca was left with consequences that didn't scream, but stayed. As the house settled into its new quiet, one truth stood undeniable. Pain inflicted in secret always demands payment in public, and some debts, once due, can never be deferred again. Morning light returned to the house without asking permission, touching walls that had once absorbed fear and silence. The space felt different now, not healed, not perfect, but honest. The kind of honesty that doesn't shout, yet refuses to lie. For the first time in a long while, the quiet didn't feel dangerous, but was this peace permanent, or just the calm after a storm? Margaret moved through her days with measured confidence, her steps slower but steadier, her presence no longer apologetic. She spoke when she needed help. She rested without guilt. Survival had taught her endurance, but justice had taught her something deeper, that suffering does not earn virtue, and silence does not equal faith. Daniel carried the weight of his decision in private, replaying moments he wished he'd seen sooner, acted on faster. He understood now that love without courage becomes complicity, and that protecting appearances can quietly destroy lives. The lesson stayed with him, heavy but necessary, shaping every choice that followed. Rebecca became a cautionary absence, her name rarely spoken, her presence replaced by the quiet consequences of her own actions. No dramatic ending followed her story. Only distance, reflection, and the slow realization that cruelty, once exposed, has nowhere to hide. The house itself seemed to remember, walls holding echoes of pain and resilience alike. It stood as proof that abuse doesn't always look violent, doesn't always announce itself, and often hides behind respectability, faith, and smiles that arrive on cue. This story does not ask for applause, only awareness. Because somewhere right now, in a home that looks just like any other, silence is being mistaken for peace, and suffering is being called patience. And the question lingers long after the screen fades to black. If you heard the scream, if you sense the silence, would you look away, or would you speak before another life learned the cost of staying quiet too long? If you were the one that was humiliated in this video, and God being so kind later saved you from the hands of your enemies, what will be your reaction towards your oppressors? comment, and subscribe on this video. Let us know your mind.